Hello, everyone, and welcome to Contagion's Antonym, or 100 Years of Waiting. A special welcome to our speaker, Jules Gill-Peterson, and our moderator, Amira Lundy-Harris. I'm Sarah Gamble. I use she and her pronouns, and I run the Pembroke Public Health Collaborative here at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. The goal of the collaborative is to bring together the fields of gender and sexuality studies and public health, and this fall we have a focus on trans youth. Trans Youth Now is a series of online events featuring prominent scholars in trans studies and trans health, speaking about existence and resistance in the anti-trans zeitgeist. I cannot think of a better person to kick off this series than Jules Gill-Peterson. A quick housekeeping note, we encourage you to submit questions for Professor Gill-Peterson using the Q&A function, and we'll address as many as we can in the time allotted. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator, who will then introduce Jules. Amira Lundy-Harris is the Nancy L. Buck Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Pembroke Center. They received their PhD in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from the University of Maryland at College Park in 2023, and their BA in Black Studies and Sexuality, Women, and Gender Studies from Amherst College in 2016. Their current book project explores Black trans people's creation and cultivation of kinship bonds. I'm so delighted that Dr. Lundy-Harris accepted my invitation to moderate this conversation, and I will now hand it over to them.
All right, thank you. My name is Mira, and I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Gill-Peterson today. Jules Gill-Peterson is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. This year, she's a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. She's the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, 2018, and a general co-editor at TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly. Her next book, A Short History of Misogyny, will be published by Verso in January 2024. Without further ado, welcome, Dr. Gill-Peterson.
Thanks so much, Amira, and thank you, Sarah, as well. So happy to be here. I'm, just over in Boston, so peering across to to Brown, but glad to be online, so more folks can join us today. And I'm really happy that this series is happening, particularly right now, and I'm honored to get to be the first installment. I'm looking forward to all the other talks to come. So I'm just going to dive right into it because I want to leave us as much time as possible in this hour for questions and for conversation. So this is Contagion's Antonym, or 100 Years of Waiting. The way trans healthcare is covered by journalists, let alone discussed on right-wing media or even social media, the public would be forgiven for thinking that it's a relatively straightforward process for anyone to gain access to the means of medical transition, including teenagers. And depending on your media diet, you might even think it were difficult to resist the pressure to transition, whether it be from peers or even from doctors or pharmaceutical companies. These chunks of disinformation form key components to the idea that being trans is socially contagious. As I've watched the idea explode in circulation and uptake with devastating results, I've also been keeping track of what passes for Contagion's antonym. Since the concept uses an epidemiological metaphor, treating trans people as a disease within the social body, understandably, its critics have largely produced what in the 19th century era of communicable diseases were called anti-contagions, rather elegantly, I think. You've probably seen these counter-arguments that being trans is not contagious at all, but rather a psychological property of the deep-rooted interior self, immune to outside influence, as well as the promotion of medicalization and especially psychological supervision as a reassuring check on any sociability to transness, particularly when it comes to young people. Obviously, having written a book detailing the lives and transitions of youth a century before this apparently new phenomenon became everyone's business, I've often wondered whether 100 years of young people being forced to wait to transition or deprived of the ability to transition would not be enough proof that social contagion is a fatuous, if not libelous, proposition. Theories of social contagion and moral panics around children's gender and sexuality have such a long history that it would really be an entirely different lecture to even scratch their surface. But the specific concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, through which social contagion is catapulted to new success, as I imagine a lot of you know, emerged only between 2016 and 2018. Let me briefly recap the chain of events. A blog called Fourth Wave Now, which endeavors to end gender-affirming care for youth, introduced the phrase in 2016 to invite parents of trans children to participate in a study by Lisa Littman, who was then an adjunct at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and later held a faculty position here at Brown in the School of Public Health before moving on to found a nonprofit corporation focused on detransition and conversion therapy. This original study also recruited parent participants from Transgender Trend and Youth Trans Critical Professionals, two other anti-trans organizations. Littman first published from this study in poster form in the Journal of Adolescent Health in 2017, followed by an article in PLOS One in 2018. That article was subject to such staggering professional criticism that the journal undertook a post-publication review a few weeks later, leading to a correction of the article, publishing a formal comment, and an apology. The correction in particular emphasized that Littman's study does not establish the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, but merely proposes it could be a rubric for future research. The study's total reliance on parents' reported subjective perceptions of their children, and even then, only parents from websites and organizations devoted to opposing gender-affirming care, comprise the heart of its methodological weakness as a work of social science. Despite the correction and a series of much longer, more attentive critiques from scholars, many of which are peer-reviewed, the concept has had a massive political life. Indeed, its significance has only been acquired in a wider media ecology that I've been looking into over the past several years, one in which paranoid and conspiratorial ideas generated usually online and picked up often by far-right and white supremacist groups are laundered into far more respectable venues by liberal institutions of journalism, political action groups, and elected officials. This media ecology operates at a much vaster scale than anti-trans propaganda and reaches people far beyond the right wing, sustaining, among other things, the anti-vaccination movement, anti-democracy conspiracies about the 2020 presidential election, and conspiracies about the COVID-19 pandemic, to name only a few. Opinion columns and journalism in papers of record began circulating the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria to varying degrees of honesty about the original study in 2017, which is also when a small cohort of psychologists began to cite it in their writing, including Kenneth Zucker, whose Toronto clinic was shut down in 2015 around allegations of conversion therapy, and Ray Blanchard, best known for the outrageously sexualizing theory of autogynephilia. Freelance journalist Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, published in 2020, is also essentially a long-form articulation of the concept. According to Schreier, vague and unnamed forces intending the breakdown of American society are tricking vulnerable young girls into thinking they are transgender. And finally, rapid onset gender dysphoria has also been integral to the political strategy of groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Republican state legislatures from the very first state law banning gender-affirming care for young people, which passed in Arkansas in 2021. As of today, although the Arkansas law has been permanently prevented from going into effect, over 20 states have passed similar laws, and several of them have been upheld in federal court going into effect. Now, the actual content of the concept here is profoundly weak, much like the methodology of the study. Littman contends to describe a distinct and new form of gender dysphoria, the vacuous diagnostic category presently employed for public and private insurance reimbursement, as well as clinical approval for medically gate-kept transition. The idea is essentially that when teenagers come out to their parents and quote unquote suddenly express a great deal of discomfort and a desire to transition, they are, one, doing something sudden instead of merely appearing to do so to their parents who didn't know they were trans before their child came out. And two, that this suddenness is different from some classical presentation of gender dysphoria, which either manifests at an incredibly young age or presents in adulthood, but somehow never in between. Both are fairly embarrassingly unfounded theories resting upon so many unverified assumptions that I actually think their weakness is very much the source of their political efficacy. The idea that parents are victims of their children's chronically online lives or a relativistic, permissive culture out of control substantiates a grievance politics in which particularly the figure of the white mother is besieged by forces seeking to destroy the family, or in the most extremist manifestations of this theory that are promoted by groups like the Proud Boys, the destruction of the white race. Now, there are granular, step-by-step, peer-reviewed criticisms of Littman's concept and study. If you're interested in those kinds of details, I highly recommend, in particular, Florence Ashley's piece in the Sociological Review monographs, which was entitled A Critical Commentary on Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, published in 2020. But I actually don't want to retread the ground of those critiques because I want to raise a different scale of critique and suggest something a little different from most of ROGD's critics. The concept has been profoundly successful politically precisely to the extent that it functions rather irrationally, reinforcing the feelings of people already libidinally invested in anti-trans narratives, including those who feel genuine animosity towards their own trans children. And for that reason, I'm actually quite skeptical of the impulse to criticize rapid onset gender dysphoria as junk science or pseudoscience. Not because Littman's study or the concept as it circulates aren't poor quality social science. I agree, I think they're exceptionally poorly conceived and very badly executed. But that weakness, as I'm suggesting, is actually key to its effectiveness. In other words, social contagion theory is fairly tactically immune to debunking, precisely because it is both conspiratorial and sentimental rather than factual. I think also construing social contagion as pseudoscience pushes it outside the charmed circle of proper science, and especially the field of gender-affirming care, as if they were one another's antithesis. And for me, this touches on a broader concern I have right now about what I might call the reactionary liberalism and intense idealization of science and medicalization that are flourishing as flaccid responses to openly authoritarian and openly fascist anti-trans political movements. The reaction, which you've probably seen of the slogan, "It's just healthcare," or in the case of young people, that this is a matter that ought to be left to cautious parents and clinicians, tends to rationalize, if not outright alibi, a horrific status quo. The defensive liberalism that is presently codifying and reinforcing as best practices an indefensible and intolerable medical system, let it be said, actually agrees with proponents of social contagion, insofar as their sober motive for gender-affirming care is to slow people down, to get in the way of their desires, and ultimately to interfere with the minimum degree of self-determination that is how you make use of your own body, all in the name of preventing hypothetical future regret. Worst of all, I'm not convinced that the scientific and clinical anchors of gender-affirming care even run contrary to the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria or are much more empirically rooted. In fact, speaking as a historian, it stands out to me that the zealous citation of the concept comes mostly from an older generation of clinicians like Zucker and Blanchard, as well as, for instance, the New York Times obsession with presenting a debate among clinicians and scientists over the standards of care. All of which suggests to me that what everyone is anxiously or deliberately avoiding, albeit for different reasons, is the profound conservatism and manifest harm of trans medicine to trans people. To outline what I mean, I'll offer a brief example of how trans medicine has long understood its mission to be epidemiological. That is, medicine serves an intentionally social function of trying to limit the spread of transition in the population. And I'll use that to come back at the end to the question of what to do with this poison pill concept. I think the long century of youth waiting to transition that I've written about in my book may be social contagion's antonym, but then again, the more disturbing possibility is that they may not be at all. So, before renaming itself the World Professional Association for Transgender Health in 2007, the organization that invented the standards of care went by the far less pronounceable acronym HBIGDA. The Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was formed in 1977, and it took its name from a physician and endocrinologist who began working with trans patients in the late 1940s. Harry Benjamin immigrated to the United States from Germany at the outset of World War I. He was a contemporary of both Sigmund Freud and Magnus Hirschfeld, whose Berlin clinic for trans people was destroyed by the Nazis. Benjamin shifted his New York City and San Francisco practices to patients that he began calling transsexuals in the early 1950s. He started to publish in medical journals and lecture on a general approach to hormone therapy and surgeries, the one that is still in use today. In 1952, the worldwide fame of Christine Jorgensen, an American who had traveled to Denmark for surgery, supercharged Benjamin's when she engaged him as her personal doctor and public ally. Their names appeared together in the press, flooding his office with requests for help. And so by the early 1960s, Benjamin was poised to consolidate all this attention into a new medical specialty. He convened a working group of like-minded clinicians to share patients and harmonize their clinical work. Reed Erickson, a wealthy trans businessman from Louisiana, privately funded their work with $2.4 million of his own dollars over the next decade and a half. Benjamin's approach was the literal blueprint for HBIGDA and later WPATH. And although he wasn't its only architect, he was instrumental in authoring the gatekeeping model, where strict diagnostic criteria intentionally exclude most people from transitioning. Of course, medical transition itself was not new in the 1950s. What was new was the desire of clinicians to professionalize, which meant they needed to produce credentials and authority for themselves. And because trans people experienced ongoing discrimination, criminalization, poverty, and political persecution, working with them could potentially diminish those clinicians' careers. But Benjamin and his peers felt the risk was worth it. By obtaining access to trans people as research subjects, they hoped to find proof of what made everyone into men and women. This was, of course, the approach medical science already took to treating homosexuality. Assigning a stigmatized minority the label of disorder or pathology allowed researchers to reverse engineer the prototypically normal person. So studying trans people, in short, was meant to explain everyone else's gender. Of course, the inconvenient problem was that trans people exhibited no physiological differences from the rest of the population. The only thing that made them different, their desire to transition, was the only real measure of what counted as being trans. For physicians like Benjamin trained to rely on biological data, this was an intolerable situation. The last thing he wanted to do was accept trans people's requests for hormones and surgery at face value, deflating his professional authority. After all, what prestige would await a medical specialty that couldn't even distinguish its patient pool from the general population? In the absence of biological criteria, Benjamin and his colleagues needed to invent a diagnosis for transsexualism that could pass for authoritative in the eyes of his peers. And the solution to this dilemma would go on to cast a very long shadow. So when H. Bigda published the first standards of care in 1979, their signature gatekeeping regime involved a requirement almost unheard of in most clinical medicine. Trans people were required to submit to long-term psychological supervision, psychiatric diagnosis, and written approval to access medications and surgeries for their physical bodies, not their minds. Everyone else, meanwhile, could obtain hormones and plastic surgeries directly. The standards of care stipulated that hormone prescriptions required one psychiatric approval letter, which could be granted only after 3 months of continuous therapy, while surgery required letters from 2 separate clinicians and only after at least 1 year of continuous therapy. This psychiatric mandate codified a practice that the first gender clinics in the US at Johns Hopkins Hospital and Stanford University had already been employing for well over a decade. The architects of those clinics had developed this psychiatric gatekeeping with Benjamin. But strangely, from the outset, they all conceded that there was no test available to determine if an individual was genuinely trans, nor was there a single effective psychiatric or psychotherapeutic intervention that could treat trans people, which for them would mean eliminating the need to transition. And this was not a quiet admission whispered behind closed doors. It was printed in medical journals and discussed at conferences openly as the cornerstone of diagnosis from the 1950s onward. That is to say, in diagnosing transsexuals, the goal was not to determine if the patient was objectively trans. Instead, psychiatric gatekeeping had the practical effect of delaying a person's access to transition, sometimes for years. And the function of therapy during that time period was to subjectively assess how well a patient could be forced to conform to cultural and social norms. And I don't mean here only norms of gender. Stanford's clinic, which opened in 1968 under the direction of Donald Laub, who would be a future president of H. Bigda, named this principle rehabilitation. During a 1-year and sometimes longer real-life test, in which patients were sent out to survive in the world without access to full medical transition, they were also expected to enroll in a program that would rehabilitate them into productive women and men. Models were hired to teach beauty ideals of clothing, makeup, and bodily comportment to women, and the clinic pressured patients to pick gender stereotype lines of work and strictly avoid some of the only ways they could make money, like dancing, performing drag, or doing sex work. Psychologists, meanwhile, appointed themselves the task of verifying that patients were exclusively heterosexual, wanting only normal marriage after surgery. Failure to live up to any of these demands could mean expulsion from the clinic or being placed on hold for years at a time. And while hormones had their own available DIY market, most surgery did not. By Laub's own estimate in 1972, of 500 prospective patients at Stanford, just 25 had been judged rehabilitated and granted surgery. The Hopkins Clinic in Baltimore had an even worse record. In its first 2 years open, 2,000 people applied and 24 were approved for surgery. But these staggering numbers were signs of success, according to clinicians. Stanford psychiatrist Norman Fisk was able to tout a 100% positive outcome rate in a 5-year follow-up study published in 1974, simply because the clinic rejected over 90% of the people who came to them, only selecting the cases they felt were the most docile and conforming. And these rejections, once again, weren't because patients were tested and found out not to be trans. No, it was that they didn't pass well enough according to a psychiatrist. They weren't judged attractive enough by a surgeon. They weren't submissive enough to their doctors. They weren't unambiguously heterosexual, or they didn't have middle-class professional aspirations. This heavy hand of psychiatric supervision was a powerful way to constrict trans people's freedoms, but it served one other aim I want to mention: liability. When Benjamin first sought out collaborators in the mid-1950s, he partnered with Elmer Belt, a Los Angeles-based plastic surgeon. Belt was having a real practical problem with his trans patients. Conservative hospital boards had begun to deny him access to operating rooms, claiming they were uncertain over the legality of operating on healthy tissues and the possibility of lawsuits. But actually, in the 1950s, plastic surgery overall was considered rather dubious by many medical professionals, especially other surgeons, because it didn't necessarily cure any physiological disease. Surgeries for trans people seem to be the strongest proof for that conservative attitude. So Benjamin and Belt landed on the idea of using psychiatric letters to indemnify both the surgeon and the hospital. And Benjamin also began applying this principle in his private practice, finding that psychiatrists could act as barriers between him and patients, weeding out anyone who might challenge the quality of his medical practice or, more importantly to him, his authority. So in other words, patient regret did matter, but it's not the kind of regret we hear about in the media today. Benjamin and Belt were worried that trans people would regret trusting them with their medical care and perhaps sue them or retaliate for substandard care. And the earliest inklings of this arrangement actually appeared decades earlier in the late 1930s, when some of the first trans people traveled to places like Johns Hopkins to request surgeries that at the time were only used to force intersex people to appear male and female. Hugh Hampton Young, head of the urology department at Hopkins, met with some of these trans people and was very anxious that they showed no physiological difference from so-called normal people, and they weren't intersex. So when a trans man from Alabama named Bernard impressed Young with a medically literate request for top and bottom surgery, Young sent him over to a colleague in psychiatry, Thomas Rennie. And that psychiatrist then issued a long, rambling letter dismissing Bernard as some sort of vague homosexual. But the letter had the practical effect of discouraging Bernard, sending him packing from Hopkins. So for over 80 years, the role of psychiatrists in trans medicine has been to protect the reputation of doctors and surgeons. Rather than minimizing future regret for accidental transitioners, the gatekeeping model has had rather the opposite effect. It has intentionally stopped many trans people from being able to transition and slowed down even more by forcing them to wait sometimes for years. HBIGDA organized its standards of care around precisely this gatekeeping principle, most of which still remains in effect today, now under the banner of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the new version of HBIGDA, as well as in private insurance reimbursement policies and state Medicaid regulations. As my book details, the predisposition of trans medicalization to delay, interfere, and gatekeep redoubled in the way clinicians treated trans children and teenagers, who they saw through an additional developmental lens. Harry Benjamin's office, for instance, would reply to letters written by trans youth asking for help in the 1960s and 70s with a very simple instruction: wait. The medical age of consent, of course, kept Benjamin from taking on as patients any children without parental consent, but the admonition also, I think, had a greater significance. Waiting to transition was presented as an endurance test for youth, a means to prove a young person's deservingness to transition if they could only manage to survive into adulthood waiting. And of course, many trans youth rejected entirely the commandment to wait as intolerable and untenable, turning the discourse of child development back on the doctor. As just one 18-year-old trans girl explained to Benjamin in a letter in 1965, quote, "I wanted to have an operation like this for several years, and now is as good a time as any. I don't want to wait until I'm growing old. I want to be a girl on my way to old age. I want to be a girl now so that I can grow up the rest of the way as a normal girl," end quote. So all of this brings me back to the question of why we actually might need contagion to defend trans people, and not only its antonym. Now, I don't mean to suggest we need contagion as a disease metaphor, which obviously has a repugnant history of serving the eugenics movement, colonial atrocities, and genocides, including the Holocaust. What we need is to de-dramatize trans childhood and admit that gender is not a psychological inner property, but profoundly, utterly social, an attribute of the self only insofar as we are social beings. Gender might resonate in American culture as something we fantasize is on the inside of the self, but in practice, it is largely given to us by strangers in the shared world. To learn to want trans youth to be in the world, to learn to want trans childhood, as the end of my book prescribed, means, I think, in a value sense, to really want in the abstract transition to spread, rather than to always anxiously contain it. I'm taking a cue here from Arne Zura and Cass Adair, who've written thoughtfully in a recent issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly about the importance of sometimes leaning into the contagious gendering of trans masculinity, so catastrophized by Abigail Schreier and company. I've also offered a public critique of a popular graph you may have seen showing rates of left-handedness in the population before and after left-handed people were subjected to coercive correction. It's a graph that shows the rate of left-handedness going up and then plateauing. But I've critiqued that precisely because the analogy arrogantly presumes to tell us that there is a natural, consistent, indeed preordained amount of trans people in the world to which we must bow and carefully, if not anxiously, police the boundaries of. But how could we possibly know such a thing? And what a pitiable value that kind of thinking assigns to being trans. We have no idea how many trans people there are or could be, and rationalizing the proper demography of any minority group will only ever redound into eugenic arithmetic anyways. So I say let's dispense with the pretense altogether. And I think if we were to do so, we may finally find ourselves poised to charge social contagion's single biggest promoter for the idea's disastrous returns. And I don't mean Lisa Littman, I mean the WPATH brand of institutionalized trans medicine that has succeeded in a brilliant PR strategy to rebrand itself as the premier organ of gender's affirmation, which it surely is not, and has exploited the political crisis bearing down on trans people to entrench a legally recognized and private insurance market regulated role as the custodians of trans people's bodies and psyches. Breaking the medicalized monopoly on trans people's autonomy, especially on youth, will require nothing less than a socially contagious transformation in the body politic, one whose form we probably cannot really anticipate at this moment. And I'm sort of sorry to say this, but not really, that I think sometimes in their melodramas and moral panics about youth transition, the right is somewhat more honest about its deep-seated fear of such transformations in the body politic than those preaching the sober, self-limiting mission of trans inclusion. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jules, for this fruitful and thought-provoking talk. Okay, so I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with just like one or two, and so that we can have some time for community questions, which I hope is going to be the focus. Okay, so the first question, you sort of gesture towards it or touch on it at the end, but I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about like what are the stakes of us reframing our thinking around institutional medicine's relationship to transition in this way, or I guess what possibilities does it open up, or sort of paraphrasing you, why we might actually need contagion to defend trans people.
Yeah, it's really sort of this question that's emerged for me in the past few years, watching how understandably defensive, right, and reactionary pro-trans mobilization has had to be, in part because of the escalation of anti-trans political violence. I'm not trying to minimize that. Of course, it's proceeded at a kind of dizzying pace, the degree of harm being enacted by law, but also the kind of extrajudicial violence that we're seeing occur, on an increasing basis is something that, is sort of, I think, led to this kind of battening down of the hatches, right? And even unintentionally, this kind of rallying around the most conservative possible defense of trans people, which is the medical model. And of course, some of that's just tactical when you have state laws, quite literally criminalizing that medical model. But part of what concerns me there is, again, not just that I think the medical model itself disapproves of transition and tries to limit it in precisely the way these, partisans of rapid onset gender dysphoria would suggest, but also that institutions like WPATH have actually become unaccountable, unelected layers of government, right? Just to say it, WPATH is a voluntary professional organization, right? It's like me going to the American Historians Association annual meeting, right? This isn't like some amazing organization that serves some higher purpose. It's for doctors and clinicians, psychiatrists and psychologists to advance their careers, right? There was very, very, very little trans involvement in its advent. At the time when the first standards of care were produced, there were like 3 or 4 trans people who were members of HBIGDA, right? And that number didn't really budge for many decades. And so WPATH has managed to produce itself as a kind of layer of government in the sense that now private insurance companies use its standards of care. They have codified them. So people's lives are affected by these documents that this professional association has created, right? State laws are increasingly recognizing WPATH. And now actually some of the federal court injunctions on bans on gender affirming care, like in Florida, actually are codifying the role of WPATH as well. And it's like, okay, well, is this what we really want to happen, right? It's a minimal, and I think actually largely losing game. I don't see this working out super well. And I actually think in some cases, it can make the situation worse. So in Florida, for instance, there was this injunction from a federal judge on this omnibus DeSantis anti-trans bill. And it was covered in the media in a really ridiculous way. It was very 2023. Every headline was like, judge eviscerates DeSantis administration, judge drops the mic on Florida. And it's like, when you go and read the injunction, okay, this judge granted 3 families, 3 families with trans teenagers permission to continue seeing their doctors and be prescribed medications. 3, not all trans kids in Florida. Okay, just 3 of them. And the judge let a lot of the rest of the law go into effect, including regulations that kicked off every single trans adult in Florida off their hormone prescriptions, right? And the way they did that was different, right? The ban on gender affirming care for minors was just a blanket ban. And indeed, those seem to be fairly unconstitutional enough that federal courts are agreeing. But the way the law took trans adults' hormones away was different. They created all these new regulations that no one could follow. They said you can't be prescribed hormones from anyone but a physician. And actually 80% of people in Florida are prescribed their hormones by a nurse practitioner because we have a doctor shortage in this country, right? So boom, all of those people suddenly can't get their hormones from their primary care physician. The state also created a new consent form only for hormone replacement therapy and said doctors have to get patients to fill out this form. But when the law went into effect, there was no form. So literally no doctor could comply with these rules, and thus everyone in Florida lost their prescriptions, at least temporarily. And what really disturbed me about that was, despite this judge's injunction going on in glowing terms about WPATH, what Florida did for adults, to me, sounds a lot like the original standards of care, creating these very high barriers to informed consent, creating all these weird supervision requirements and licensing requirements that don't exist for other forms of healthcare. And so I think that's probably partly why the judge didn't enjoin those parts of the law. They might not actually be unconstitutional. And then by codifying this WPATH model, I think actually, part of what the decision is doing is opening the door to Florida successfully banning, transition for adults. So it really worries me, just from a tactical perspective, that this is the direction that things have gone. But then on the flip side, to get to the other aspect of your question, I think there's just a much bigger scale we could be asking questions at in this moment, which is like, what would we prefer to be happening right now, right? Instead of playing defense always and always replying to, trying to debunk or correct or bring facts to bear on people who are, obviously acting in bad faith and really escalating their attacks. What's a bigger, broader, more affirmative, more exciting vision for trans freedom and bodily autonomy than medicalization? And I think that would also have an effect in terms of political mobilization. I just don't think many people want to get up in the morning and go cheer for the medical model that continues to mistreat them, if not neglect and abuse them, and that most people never had access to before. So, broadly, I think of this as a similar, and it's an interlocked issue with abortion, right? People aren't necessarily super excited to get out and defend the status quo of Roe versus Wade, where so many poor Black and brown people didn't have access to abortion anyways. Instead of like a robust reproductive justice framework that completely, kind of shatters the idea that we need these narrow kind of legal rights to privacy, as opposed to making demands, right? Demands on the state, demands on the public, demands on one another of solidarity for the kind of world that we would like to live in which we're free to do things like get abortions or transition. So I think it's like both tactical to me, but also about this much larger shift in this moment, and really trying to break a little bit the way that I think a lot of liberal institutions are actually quite happily wedded to their relationship to authoritarians and actually are sort of working in symbiosis with them. I think we really have to be careful to break that relationship if we want to actually mount an effective counter politics. Yeah. That was a very long answer, but I see we have some questions coming in now. So
that was great, and it actually does move us into some of the questions from the community. So I'll just read them. The first question is, I 1000% share your frustration with aligning with the medical model, even as we can glimpse other liberatory models of gender identity. Are there any other movements / communities, etc., that we could ally with beyond uneasy medical partnerships? I often think we could do more to link trans rights with the abortion rights movement, for example, seeing the common cause of autonomy over our bodies, and continues to say, in parentheses, I find tremendous possibility in gender as body autonomy, as betrayal, as collaborative future making.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. Thanks. You were reading my mind as you were typing it in there. Right. I mean, I think coalition is really, to my mind, the biggest task at hand, right? Building much bigger constituencies here. And so that's also not just like this sort of debate style of the transgender question, trans debate, trans rights. Should we or should we not, right? Part of the way that functions so effectively is by exceptionalizing, singling out, and putting trans people to the side as somehow wildly different from all other groups of people who are experiencing the crises of contemporary capital and politics. When in reality, I think trans people just sort of often have a particularly Baroque, well-informed kind of Baroque understanding of the systems that are, in crisis in this moment, and actually can be of incredible, use inside larger movements. So connecting to abortion and reproductive justice, absolutely. I mean, it's the same legal principles, the same state legislatures, the same right-wing groups, the same Supreme Court. I mean, we're talking about the exact same dilemma here, right? And the idea that the state can extremely override people's not just bodily, zone of integrity, but interfere in their access to medical resources. It's the exact same playbook, right? And so it would be bizarre not to create more allyship there. And I think more broadly, connecting with disability justice activists and people who are actively organizing around the just incredible eugenic logic of the COVID-19 public health response and the incredible scale of death and suffering that has been, allowed to go on quite openly, right? There are just a lot of places where the mode of connection and allyship is just that we're dealing with the same dynamics, right? And I think that to my mind is really the task at hand. So yeah, that I think as big a coalition as you can get, right, is probably what it's going to take to move the needle, rather than doing this sort of compartmentalized version of response where we only go to the correct experts who are in charge and who are the custodians of this area and promise our fealty to them and hope that they're able to bail us out, which is not really what they're there to do in the first place. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a second question. Thank you so much for this rich talk. I'm wondering if the scope of your work allows for any comparative studies about how this conversation around contagion has developed globally, and even if not, have there been any instances from other regions that you've encountered which drew your attention or curiosity? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question. Anti-trans political movements have transnational network connections, right? It is a little bit an Anglosphere thing, the version that we're living through, right? The US, the UK, Canada, Australia. There's this sort of particular brand of anti-trans movement that really has been quite intensely focused on the idea of social contagion. I really think it is a very much an Anglosphere kind of concept. But anti-trans politics seem to be most of use to authoritarian political movements. So you can see them obviously in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Russia. You can track them in all sorts of places. Really complex and interesting and alarming developments, in right-wing movements in India. You can track similar things in the Philippines, throughout Latin America, right? Often, many of which are funded by US organizations, particularly Christian organizations and churches. But yeah, I think the idea of social contagion, right, is a particularly Anglophone idea. But I also want to say, right, kind of thinking through the actual complexity of the sociability of something like trans as a category, we also have to think about the kind of colonial politics of contagion, that actually there is a globalizing export of a Euro-American, a deeply ethnocentric version of trans codified in things like standards of care that are being held up as the gold standard or best practices around the world and are reshaping laws, right, sort of following Yogyakarta principles of gender self-determination in many, many different countries around the world, but are also affecting the actual delivery of healthcare. And although the standards of care have this weird sort of section that's like, cultural competency is really important, it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point, right? So actually, part of the other side of contagion of trans, not really relevant to this conversation today per se, though, is like, that it's not really contagion, it's actually like colonial circulation and the replacement of many thousands of other ways of life with a Western transgender version is a process that's been ongoing for centuries, but I think is accelerating in certain ways right now. So definitely an area where I really hope more folks are going to be doing even more research and writing, because it's super important. Yeah, really appreciate that question.
Awesome. The third question that we have is, thank you for your presentation. I'm sympathetic to your argument, but I'm skeptical of the political viability of the reframing you propose, given the ferocity of the current anti-trans moment. From both political observation and personal experience, I've noticed that for many people, conservative arguments like the left-handedness graphic or the assertion that transition results from an essentialized true self are the only way they can be made to understand transness. How do we go about reframing the debate responsibly without playing into right-wing narratives about contagion?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for being so thoughtful in putting it together too. And I want to underline that reference to the ferocity of the anti-trans movement. I think that's really key, right? And I totally know what this question asker is talking about, right? Those deeply conservative arguments about being born this way or the left-handedness graph are so popular because most of the people who find those acceptable agree with right-wing ideas to a large extent, right? They don't actually like trans people. They don't actually want there to be lots of trans people in the world. They're relieved to hear, oh, there's only actually so many. And so, that number will never get too high. And they were born that way, so it's not their fault. And really implicitly, it's a deeply transphobic, form of inclusion, right? So the liberal project of inclusion, well, they couldn't help it, just happened to be trans, or, wouldn't wish that on anyone, but what can you do? It's in their brain. So, one thing I want to say about that, right, is like, this is difficult in terms of building political coalition, but it's like, I don't really think that kind of allyship is that useful, right? And one of the ways I don't think it's useful is I think doubling down on the medical model, it involves a lot of sacrifice, right? So we have gender affirming care in this version before it's being banned, but it's a version premised on the sacrifice of most people who want to transition who don't qualify, right? That's the legacy of this field of medicine, is most people don't get to transition. And to me, that's sort of an intolerable kind of sacrifice to make in order to advance a smaller group of trans people's interests, right? It class stratifies and racializes trans people as a class. So it's mostly middle-class trans people and predominantly white trans people who get access to gender affirming care and all of the civil rights that come along with it, right? The ability to change gender markers, the ability to work, in formal employment and things like that. And so, I guess my sort of pitch here is that what's missing on the pro-trans side is ferocity. No one's really, going toe-to-toe. No one's matching the danger being targeted and directed at us. And I actually think failing to match that is itself a kind of lost opportunity in terms of political tactics. But I don't think we're losing too much by giving up this conservative, essentialized point of view, because I don't think it really ends up helping very many people, and it deliberately sacrifices entire groups of people, right? Like I said, I think we could end up in a place, well, not like I said, I'm thinking about the fact that I think we could end up in a place in a few years where transition, like abortion used to be, is technically legal, but most people can't really get it. Maybe kids can't transition at all, and maybe a lot of adults can't in certain states too. And, that's really awful. That's really horrifying. But that was also de facto the reality prior to this political movement, that most trans people who wanted to transition couldn't get access to it. So as disturbing and dangerous as things are, I think that's actually precisely the reason why now is a good moment to question, right, whether working so hard on reassuring people that their animosity towards trans people in general is okay, and that they can just tolerate the ones that doctors have told us are here for good, that will really be anything but a kind of Pyrrhic victory. So, but I just want to say I really empathize with the danger. And actually, the question of how to do this without playing back into the hand of the right on contagion is a really good question. I'm still thinking a lot about that. I think it does, again, have to do with this refusal to match ferocity, right? Like, it's just politics. You have to outflank the other side, right? You're going to have to out-organize them. You're going to have to develop techniques of persuasion that are more compelling, right? And, I wouldn't pretend to be able to develop all of those by myself, but I do think there is a sort of question here about how to reclaim sociability, right? I probably would say, let's not call it contagion, but like sociability, right? And just say like, no, gender is sociable. So like, yeah, you should be a little unnerved by trans people. We're here to unnerve you because of the world that we live in, right? But like, I think that's a fight worth having because otherwise we have to give up too many of our beloveds to get a few people across that finish line.
Excellent. I think we have enough time for a couple more, at least one. The fourth question is, this was amazing. Thank you so much. What strategies of trans contagion beyond existing as trans are you thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, broadly, the way I think about it is gender already is contagious. Like, our psyches are contagious. We're all formed intersubjectively. So to me, it's more about a shift in acknowledgement and rhetoric rather than having to be much of a shift in practice, right? I actually just think it is the case that our genders are contagious, so that we're sort of locked into a project of denial and disavowal to reassure ourselves that that's not the case. And so I think we're just sort of ignoring everything that actually falls falls under what you were referring to as existing, as trans, right? And I think that to my mind is so not really sort of developing anything new here, but actually thinking about how we can come to claim just the basic empirical realities of how we live in the world. And sort of making some of those kinds of value statements that I don't merely just want to tolerate people if they turn out to be trans after a lot of investigation, but I actively greet and welcome trans people in the world. I'm not afraid of people transitioning. I want transition to be as easy to do as possible. Like those are probably some of the action points, but more broadly to me, it's kind of like a paradigm shift. Yeah. Or I don't know, an acknowledgement. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question about WPATH. Can these types of gatekeeping bodies be transformed, or is the gatekeeping function inextricable from their institutional mission?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm writing more about the history of WPATH right now, so I'm a little early into this project, but I don't see how it could be taken out. I mean, I don't know, WPATH was formed to gatekeep. I mean, that was its modus operandi, the explicit reason it came into existence. And so I'm not sure how it would ever abandon that, right? It has professional stakes in doing so. People's careers, salaries, grants, faculty positions, clinical businesses all depend on this system, right? And now it's so deeply intertwined with private insurance and public insurance reimbursement schemas. I think it's really hard to imagine WPATH letting go of that. The standards of care have been subject to critique nonstop since the first ones were published in 1979. And for years, the organization, if you go and read their internal records, they know that, and they're writing each other letters being like, okay, basically everyone hates us, like all trans people hate us, and they think we don't care about them and we're really cruel and we torture them because we won't even change these standards. And then slowly they kind of incrementally revise them, and now it's become such a bogged down political process. I'm just very skeptical of it, like I know lots of people who are part of WPATH. I've been a part of consulting, processes myself. So it's not like a particular animus on my part. I'm just very skeptical as a historian, having looked at the moving parts and the historical legacy. I'm not sure how you take an organization that existed to gatekeep and make it non-gatekeeping, right? It just doesn't really have any other function. And I think the rebranding to WPATH in 2007 was really smart. All of a sudden, this organization that did the opposite of affirming gender, right, since 1977 is like, oh no, now we're the premier venue for affirming gender. Like that was a really smart move, but they didn't actually change the standards very much. You still need psychiatric supervision and diagnosis to access physical health care. That's, to me, absurd on its face. It's illogical. It serves no legitimate purpose. There's no diagnosis of being trans going on. It's just a gatekeeping interference tactic. But I don't know what WPATH would do if they eliminated that role. I mean, like half their membership would no longer have part of their job anymore. So yeah, I'm very skeptical about it. And just to say, there are rival alternative organizations, and so why does WPATH have to be the ship that sinks or swims, right? Sinks or floats? I don't know, bad metaphor, right? There could be an alternative mode for doing this.
We have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to slip one more question in, I think,
Sure.
and it's related to this. So the question is, I'm interested on your thoughts regarding standardizing care for trans folks. I worked at Mount Sinai and was very involved in opening the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery, which we relied on members of US WPATH to shape the center and sponsored doctors to learn how to provide gender-affirming care. I hear your concerns surrounding WPATH, so I'm wondering what you believe to be the most effective way to teach doctors gender-affirming care and shaping standards of care.
Yeah, it's such a great question because there are these real practical issues we have, right? In places that can still provide gender-affirming care. I mean, the wait lists and lack of qualified clinicians is just kind of off the charts, right? At the same time, I think there are bigger practical questions to be had, right? I mean, gender-affirming care as a specialty doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense to me, right? Like hormone therapy, not, primary care physicians and nurse practitioners can deliver that. And it seems in some ways that, like, that would go a long way if we sort of refigure, right, hormones as part of primary care. That's, training given in medical school. That might be one way to solve that practical bottleneck issue. But when it comes to qualified surgeons, like, this is a really huge issue. There aren't enough surgeons who are qualified to meet the demand out in the world, right? And so I also think there's a bigger question about investing in the infrastructure that it takes to make transition accessible, right? And that involves medical school changes in medical schools. And these are all just, to me, sort of forms of harm reduction, right? It's like, hormones, medicalizing hormones to the extent that we've done it doesn't really make much sense to me. But obviously surgeries are as I would know, since I'm writing a book about this, not very easy to do yourself. So like, we need qualified surgeons who are available, right, at no cost to people. I think there's a real training bottleneck going on, but it's going to require investment, right? It costs money. And so I think that's also a shift towards more public commitments to funding, but also to funding healthcare in general. I mean, we just have such a shortage of doctors, skilled specialists, primary care physicians. There is a crisis in US healthcare, and trans healthcare is really only maybe one of many sites that are deeply affected by it. So I really hear that question. And I think that a public collective solution of investment is going to be much more effective here than anything else. Yeah. Anyway, this hour went by really fast. I'm sorry, I was asking questions in such a rambly way. I could have gotten to more of them.
No, it's perfect.
Wonderful. I was just coming on to say I'm sorry that we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Gill-Peterson and Dr. Lundy Harris. We are so appreciative of this fantastic conversation and dialogue. So thank you all. The recording for this will be on the Pembroke Center YouTube playlist. So you can check that out and send it to the folks who couldn't make it, and just deep appreciation to both of you.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great day.